Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is considered to be one of the most influential scientists of the 20th century. Dr. Jane Goodall's work has given the world a remarkable window into humankind's closest living relatives, chimpanzees. Her dedication to community conservation, poverty eradication, wildlife and the environment is lifelong and inspiring. At the summit, she will share her story about how her work with the Jane Goodall Institute and Roots and Shoots. She will also address the mounting global crisis that we currently face and how, as individuals, grantmakers and philanthropists, we must turn back the clock and rewind the future. Her keynote will share her story about her work, and we are indeed honoured and privileged e te mārei kura, e te upukarea o te puna mātauranga, e te wahine teitei, teitū, teiwha, nā mātou te whiwhi kia tae mai nei i raro i te tuanui o tēnei ki whare, ke te tuku i ngā mihi ki a koe mo tō mahi whakahirahira puta noa ki te ao. We're going to watch a video by way of introduction to our very esteemed guest speaker that's travelled a long way to be with us today, Dr. Jane Goodall.
It's been an amazing journey, this life of mine. This planet has filled me with the wonder of all living things, great and small. We cannot ignore this earth that surrounds us, that feeds us, shelters us, replenishes our bodies and our souls, and stretches our imaginations, where animals, plants, air, water, all care for us. We're all interconnected. People, animals, our environment. When nature suffers, we suffer. And when nature flourishes, we all flourish. I do believe in the possibility of a world where we can live in harmony with nature, but only if every one of us does our part to make that world a reality, so that when you look back over your journey, your life, you can truly say, I did make a difference. Well, good afternoon, all of you. I'm very happy to be here in New Zealand. I arrived very late last night. And so now here I am with a room full of philanthropists, and I want to start off by saying how much I and the Jane Goodall Institute owe to people like you. I probably wouldn't be here otherwise. You know, when we go on our life's journey, we can't do it alone. We all need support. And I've been so fortunate in my long life to have so many people helping me along the way. There are two members of the Jane Goodall Institute here with us today, Melanie Shepherd and Neil Gilbert. And everywhere I go now, in 34 countries where we have Jane Goodall Institutes, there are teams of people to welcome me and help me travel around in that country. But there's one person I want to acknowledge most, because, you know, how did this little girl who was born in England all those years ago to a family with very little money, how is it that I'm traveling all this way around the world? And why is it that people like you want to hear what I say? And so the one person who has really helped me to become who I am was my amazing mother. I was born loving animals, and she supported that love. And she didn't even get phased out when she came in to my room. I don't remember this, but I was 1.5, and she found a whole handful of earthworms in my bed. And instead of getting angry, she just quietly said, "Jane, they need the garden or they'll die." And then she helped me by getting books for me to read about animals, thinking I would learn to read more quickly. When I was growing up, there was no TV. It was books. And I was 8 years old when I met Dr. Dolittle. And if you don't know Dr. Dolittle, well, rectify that and get the story of Dr. Dolittle. And then I used to spend hours in a second-hand bookshop. War was raging, World War II. And, you know, one of my first relationships with Australia was that families in England who didn't have too much money and had children were sent food packages from Australia, and we got those packages. I think we got one every 3 months or something. So that was my first relationship, really, with Australia. And so there was war raging. We had very little money. My father had joined the army. But I found a little second-hand bookshop, and I used to spend hours in there. So I was 10 years old, and I found this little book, which I still have today, and I just had saved up enough money to buy it. It was 1 shilling and 6pence. I don't know what that would be today, but not very much. And I took it home and read it, and that little book was Tarzan of the Apes. Well, that's when my dream began. I will grow up, go to Africa, live with wild animals, and write books about them. Of course I fell in love with that glorious lord of the jungle. And what did Tarzan do? He married the wrong Jane. So, well, yes, he did. Anyway, of course I knew there wasn't a Tarzan. My dream, everybody laughed at me. How will you get to Africa? It's far away. You don't have money. There's a war raging. And you're just a girl. Girls didn't do that sort of thing. But my mother said, if you really want to do something like this, you're going to have to work awfully hard and take advantage of every opportunity, but don't give up. And that's the message I've taken around the world to young people, particularly in disadvantaged communities. And I wish Mum was alive to know how many people have written to me or said to me, Jane, I want to thank you because you taught me that I can do it too, because you did it. So at any rate, you all know my dream did come true. I had to work very hard. There was no money for university, just enough money for a secretarial course, terribly boring, but I had to get a job. Then a letter from a school friend inviting me to Kenya. Opportunity. Couldn't save money in London, went home, worked as a waitress, which is very hard work, by the way, and eventually saved up enough money to get to Africa, and it was by boat. There weren't planes going back and forth in those days. The few that did were very expensive. So the journey took about a month, and it was a magical journey. And I was fortunate after staying with my friend. Somebody said, Jane, you need to meet Louis Leakey, famous paleontologist, but also interested in modern animals and comparing their skeletons with those of the fossil bones that he was searching for. And somebody said, Jane, if you're interested in animals, you should meet Louis. So I went to meet him at the Natural History Museum, and I think he was impressed by how much I knew about African animals because I'd read every book I could and spent hours in the Natural History Museum in London. So guess what? 2 days before I met him, his secretary had suddenly quit. He needed a secretary, and there I was. So that boring old secretarial course had a very important role to play in my life. At any rate, he continued to be impressed by how much I knew, I suppose, and I got this incredible opportunity to go and live with and learn from not just any animal, but the one most like us. But it took him a year to get the money. Who was going to give money to a young girl who hadn't even been to college to go and do something that nobody was doing in those days, not even men? And so that was my first experience of philanthropy. It was Leighton Wilkie, a wealthy American businessman, who said, okay, Louis, here's money for 6 months. We'll see how she does. Well, the first weeks and months were very depressing for me because the chimps took one look at me and ran away. I knew if I had time, I could gain their trust, but did I have time? I knew if that 6 months' money ran out and I hadn't seen something exciting, then that would be the end, and I would have let Louis Leakey and Leighton Wilkie down. Fortunately, after the 4th month, one chimpanzee, he was very handsome, had a beautiful white beard, I called him David Greybeard, and he began to lose his fear. And it was he that I saw on that never-to-be-forgotten day, sitting on a termite mound, breaking off grass stems, using them to fish termites from the mound, picking off the termites that were clinging on with their lips, and breaking off leafy twigs. And to make them into tools, he had to carefully strip the leaves. So he was using and making tools, which wouldn't be exciting now because we know that a number of animals, including birds, can use and make tools. But in those days, science had decided that humans and only humans used and made tools. We were called man the tool maker. And so it was that observation that enabled Leakey to go to the National Geographic Society in the US, and they agreed to continue funding the work, and they sent out a photographer and filmmaker, Hugo van Lauwijk, to record what I was observing with the chimps. Now, with the assurance of funding coming in, I could relax. And thanks to David Greybeard, I got to know the other members of the community, because if he was sitting with a group that was ready to run, they looked from him, sitting calmly, to me and back, and I suppose they thought, well, she can't be so frightening after all. And so I got to know all his acquaintances out in the forest, the other males, Goliath and Mike and Mr. McGregor and Mr. Wurzel, and the females, old Flo with her large family, Fabian, Figan, Fifi, and subsequently little Flint. And what was so striking, the more I learned about them, the more I realized how like us they were. Watch the males competing for dominance, swaggering at each other, showing off, shaking their fist, bunching their lips in a furious scowl, trying to be intimidating. Doesn't that remind you of some male politicians today? And then I was absolutely fascinated by watching the relationship between mothers and their developing infants, the close bonds forming, as we now know today, good mothers and bad mothers in chimp society, just as in our own society. And the best mothers are affectionate, protective, but not too protective. But above all, they are supportive, just like my mother. And it turns out that the offspring of those supportive mothers, the males reach a higher position in the male hierarchy. They're more self-assured, probably sire more infants, and the females are better mothers. So postures and gestures, kissing, holding hands, patting one another, begging for food, swaggering, shaking the fist, using a number of objects as tools for different purposes, including rocks as weapons. Some of them have a very accurate throw. And also, it was a complete shock to me to find that, like us, they have a dark and brutal side. They're even capable of a kind of primitive war, so that the males of a larger community totally annihilated a community, a smaller community, neighboring them in the south, and took over that territory. They're highly territorial. But just like us, they're also compassionate, loving, and truly altruistic. So if a mother dies, her infant will surely die if it's under 3, because up until 3 years, they depend on the mother's milk. It's a long childhood. But if they're over 3 years old, they will either be looked after by an older brother or sister, but if there is no older sibling, then an unrelated individual may adopt that child and save its life. I'd been at Gombe for 2 years when Leakey told me I had to go to Cambridge. I had to get a degree. I had to stand on my own 2 feet. There was no time for a BA, he said. You have to go straight for a PhD in ethology, but I didn't even know what ethology meant, simply behavior. And I was very nervous when I got there. Imagine how I felt to be told I'd done everything wrong. I shouldn't have given the chimpanzees names. They should have had numbers. I couldn't talk about their personalities, their minds, or their emotions like happiness, sadness, fear, despair. That was unique to humans. But fortunately, as a child, I'd had a wonderful teacher who taught me that in this respect, those learned professors were wrong. And that was my dog, Rusty. You can't share your life in a meaningful way with a dog, a cat, a pig, a horse, a rabbit, a bird, I don't care, and not know that, of course, we're not the only beings on the planet with personalities, minds, and above all, emotions. Well, I got my degree anyway, and I built up a research station in Gombe and went back to the best days of my life. I could spend hours out in the rainforest, and that's where I learned about the interconnectedness of all living things and how every species, no matter how small, has a role to play in this wonderful tapestry of life. And a small species that may seem insignificant may be the food of another, and that too may become extinct. And this can lead to a chain of events leading to ecosystem collapse. That's what's so frightening about the recent UN report, the fact that 1 million animal species and plant species are on the brink of extinction, and already so many have gone. Well, why did I leave that paradise? I left it in 1986 when at a big conference I realized for the first time how rapidly chimpanzee numbers were dropping across Africa as a result of deforestation, as a result of the bushmeat trade, the illegal hunting of wild animals for food, as a result of the live animal trade, shooting mothers to steal their babies to sell locally as pets or overseas to train for entertainment or, in those days, medical research. The chimpanzees disappearing because human populations were growing, moving deeper into chimpanzee habitat, and chimpanzees are biologically so like us that they can catch our infectious diseases to which they have been unable to build up resistance. And so I went to that conference as a scientist. I left as an activist. I knew I had to do something. I didn't know what to do. I managed to get some money together, and I went to 7 different range countries in Africa. And I learned a great deal about the plight facing the chimpanzees. And one thing I'll never forget was the first infant whose mother had been shot for bushmeat, and he was tied up in an African market on top of a tiny little cage, and he was curled up on his side, and I could see his eyes, they were glazed, they had lost hope. And I went up to him and I made the very soft, panting sound of chimpanzee greeting. And this little being sat up, looked at me with those big eyes. A little spark had come into them, and he reached out a small hand towards me. I knew I had to do something. You can't buy these sad little creatures because that perpetuates the trade. But luckily, I was able to get the American ambassador to persuade the wildlife minister to confiscate this infant because it was illegal. And that began the Jane Goodall Institute's sanctuary programs to look after orphan chimpanzees because you can't put them back in the forest. So we have the largest sanctuary in Africa, in the Republic of Congo, but we also have another one in South Africa, and we started 2 others, which fortunately, because they're very expensive, have been taken over by the government in those countries. But we couldn't afford to run these sanctuaries if it wasn't for philanthropists like you. So as I'm traveling around learning more about the plight of the chimpanzees, I'm also learning more about the plight of the people living in and around chimpanzee habitat, the crippling poverty, the lack of good health and education facilities, the gradual degradation of the land as they cut down more trees and ever more trees in their desperation to grow more food to feed their families or to make charcoal to make some money. And it all came to a head when I flew over the little Gombe National Park, where I started my study, which is still going on today with a team of researchers. In fact, it is the longest unbroken study of any group of primates and probably all animals in the wild in the world. Well, when I started in 96, when I started in 1960, Gombe was part of the equatorial forest belt that stretched across equatorial forest, almost unbroken. When I flew over in 1990, it was a tiny island of forest surrounded by completely bare hills. The land was overfarmed and infertile, and even trees on the steep slopes had been cut down by these desperate people. And that meant terrible erosion, the little streams of fresh water getting silted up, and Lake Tanganyika gradually getting more and more cloudy. And that's when it hit me. If we don't do something to help these people to find ways of living without destroying their environment, then we can't even try to save the chimpanzees. So in 1994, the Jane Goodall Institute began its particular brand of community-based conservation. We call it Take Care, or Takari. And it started with a small group of local people going into the villages and asking them, the 12 villages around Gombe, what we could do to make their lives better. Not a bunch of arrogant white people going into these poor villages and telling them what we were going to do to make things better. And gradually the people trusted us, and we began to provide all kinds of innovative ways of improving their lives. And I think one of the best was the Grameen, based on the Grameen Bank, microcredit opportunities, particularly for women. And in addition to growing more food, pushing the local Tanzanians to improve the health and education facilities, we were also raising money, again, very often from philanthropists, to improve the lives of women, to empower them, and to raise money to keep girls in school during and after puberty, because it's been found all around the world that as women's education improves, family size tends to drop. And in Africa, as in so many countries, in fact worldwide, it's this relentless growth of the human population that is causing so many of our other environmental problems. This program is so successful, we now have it in 104 villages throughout the whole range of chimpanzees in Tanzania, where most of them don't live in protected areas, but live in village forest reserves. Each village now provides 1 or 2 volunteers who, even if they can't read or write, can learn to use a smartphone. And they've decided they will go into their forest, they're very proud, and they will record, for example, an illegally cut tree, an animal trap, a cartridge on the ground, or a sighting of a chimpanzee or a nest or a leopard or a pangolin. And all this information is uploaded onto a platform in the clouds, Global Forest Watch. So it's transparent. This program is now in 6 other African countries. And I can confidently say that there are forests, chimpanzees, and of course all the other wildlife in those forests, all the biodiversity is there because of these programs. So we have made a difference. But of course, the deforestation goes on. These programs cost money. I began traveling more and more around the world, seeking funding, but also raising awareness. I don't like seeking funding. I have to, but I don't like it. But I do like raising awareness. And as I was traveling around the different continents, I was learning more and more about what we are doing to this planet. So I talked about the similarities between us and chimps, but what is the biggest difference? Because clearly we're different. The explosive development of our intellect. So animals are way, way more intelligent than we used to think. Not just chimpanzees and the other great apes and monkeys, whales and elephants, but we now know that birds are highly intelligent, that the octopus is capable of making houses out in a sandy place where there are no rocks. Even bumblebees can be trained to perform simple tasks. But none of it compares with a species that created a rocket that went up to Mars, from which a little robot crawled and took photographs of the red planet, where once it was thought maybe life could be supported. If you've seen those photographs, you don't want to go and live on Mars. So how is it the most intellectual species to ever walk this planet is destroying its only home? And I think there must be a disconnect between this clever brain and the human heart, love and compassion. And I truly believe that only when head and heart work together can we attain our true human potential. So, learning what we're doing, I think you all know. You know about the destruction of the forests and the oceans, the two great lungs of the world that absorb carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen. They're losing their ability to provide those benefits for us. You know about the pollution of air, water, and land. You know about the intensive industrial farming that is poisoning the land with chemicals, chemical fertilizers, and chemical pesticides and chemical herbicides. You know about genetically modified foods that in many instances are causing the use of more of those fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides. And then there's the intensive animal farming. Billions of animals confined in the most horrendous conditions. And even if you don't care about the cruelty involved, the fact that they have to be fed, huge areas of environment are cleared to grow the grain to feed them. More grain is now grown to feed our domestic animals than to feed starving people. And lots of fossil fuel to get the grain to the animals to the abattoir, and the meat to the table. Then the animals, this is why I carry cow with me. Not a very imaginative name, but this is cow. And I use her especially when I'm talking to children. You know, food goes in one end and gas comes out the other. We all do it. This gas is methane, and that's an even more virulent gas than CO2 in these greenhouse gases that are forming a blanket around the globe, trapping the heat of the sun, leading to these dramatic changes in weather patterns that I encounter everywhere I go, leading to climate change. And so all of these problems, along with the fact that there's so much violence in the world today, and that'll only get worse, and the migration, the immigrant situation will only get worse as we run out of natural resources. Have you ever thought that to have unlimited economic development on a planet with finite natural resources isn't possible? If our populations keep growing, if we can't change our unsustainable lifestyles, and if we can't alleviate poverty. Those three things we have to do. We also have to try and eliminate corruption. No wonder I was meeting so many young people around the world who seemed to have lost hope. And when I began to talk to them, I found that mostly they were just apathetic. They didn't seem to care. But some were deeply depressed, and some were angry, even violent. And when I asked them, why do you feel this way? Well, the answer was more or less the same. You've compromised our future, and there's nothing we can do about it. There's a saying, we haven't inherited this planet from our parents, we borrowed it from our children. But we haven't been borrowing our children's future, we've been stealing it, and we're still stealing it today. And was it true, though, when they said there's nothing we can do about it? I think there's a window of time, and luckily there are other scientists who support this. I don't know how big the window is, but there is a window of time when, if we all get together, we can start to heal some of the harm we've inflicted. And so it was in 1991 with 12 high school students in Tanzania who got their friends together who felt as they did about the problems surrounding them, the illegal dynamite fishing that was destroying the coral reefs, the poaching in their national parks, and why wasn't the government doing more about it, the street children with no homes, the cruel way that stray dogs were treated, these and other problems. And we talked about that. And so we decided to form this Roots and Shoots program, which has become a movement. The main message: every single individual has a role to play and makes a difference. And that means every one of us in this room, every day we live, we make some impact on the planet. And we can choose what sort of impact we make. We can think about, what do we buy? Where did it come from? How was it made? Did it harm the environment? Did it result in cruelty to animals? Is it cheap because of child slave labor somewhere else? If millions and then billions of people begin making ethical choices, we move into a very different kind of world. And young people understand this. And they understand that people cannot make ethical choices while they're living in conditions of crippling poverty. And they understand about our unsustainable lifestyle. And they're beginning to understand about the relentless growth of human populations rising up even as populations of other species are generally declining. We decided in that first meeting that every group of Roots and Shoots would choose, we wouldn't dictate to them. They would choose 3 projects to make the world a better place. 1 to help people, 1 to help animals, 1 to help the environment. And what began with these 12 high school students is now in 60 countries. We have members in kindergarten and members in university and everything in between. We have some adult groups, actually, but it's mainly for youth. It's growing across New Zealand. And one benefit is that we try to bring these young people together. Sometimes it's only virtually, sometimes it's through social media. If we can, it's face-to-face. And they're beginning to understand that just because people have different colored skin, wear different clothes, maybe have a different diet, come from different countries, cultures, and religions, we're all the same. If we fall over and cut ourselves, our blood is the same. Our tears are the same when we cry, and our laughter is the same when we feel happy. We're one human family. And so the goal of Roots and Shoots is to create a critical mass of young people who understand that while we need money to live, it goes wrong when we live for money, unless living for money provides money for programs that are trying to make the world a better place. Making money to help the Jane Goodall Institute, for example. Making money to help grow Roots and Shoots around New Zealand, because I can tell you, this program, Roots and Shoots, is truly making a difference. And when I'm in Tanzania, where it began, I was there in February for the anniversary of the founding of Roots and Shoots. And can you imagine being with 400 university and high school students, some Muslim, some Christian, out in the open, and at the end of showing me all the things that they'd done, all the plans they had for the future, all 400 of them stood up and said, "Together we can. Together we will save the world." It was moving. I can tell you it was moving. And I warn you, at the end, I'm going to get you to do that, but not just yet. So the youth, Roots and Shoots, is my main reason for hope, because they are changing the world as we speak. And everywhere I go, there are young people wanting to tell Dr. Jane what they're doing to make the world better. Second reason for hope is this brain. We're beginning to come up with innovative technology to enable us to live in greater harmony and to think about our own ecological footprints every day. Third reason for hope, the resilience of nature. If you fly over Gombe today, you won't see those bare hills. The trees have come back. the people understand they need the trees just as wildlife does for their own future. There are places in New Zealand that have been destroyed, but with time and some help can once again support nature. There are animal species and plant species in New Zealand that were on the brink of extinction, but are being given another chance. My next reason for hope, social media. For the first time in human history, we can reach out around the world and bring people together to raise their voices over an issue of common concern, which gives strength to people who maybe had felt isolated before. And finally, there's the indomitable human spirit, the people who tackle what seems to be impossible and won't give up. And that's why I carry Mr. H. Mr. H was given to me 29 years ago for my birthday, and by a man called Gary Horn. He lost his eyesight when he was 21 in the US Marines. For some odd reason, he decided to be a magician. And everybody said, but Gary, you can't be a magician if you're blind. The children don't know he's blind. He arranges his props before. And at the end, he'll say to the children, you know, something might go wrong in your life, because we never know. But if it does, don't give up. There's always a way forward. He does scuba diving. He does cross-country skiing. He does skydiving. And amazing, I think, he's just taught himself to paint. And he gave me Mr. H 29 years ago for my birthday, thinking he was a stuffed chimpanzee, and I made him hold the tail. Gary, chimps don't have tails. Well, never mind, take him where you go, and you know I'm with you in spirit. So he's been to 65 countries and been touched by maybe 5 million people, because I say the inspiration rubs off. So this indomitable human spirit. And you can't give up. If we're going to give up, if we're going to believe the gloom and doom of some scientists, then we have no right to have even one child. How can you have a child and bring that child into a world where you have no hope for the child's future? We can't do that. And as I say, if we get together, but it's got to be soon. I don't know how wide this window is, and it's closing all the time. And it's people like you who can help us to give more hope, more inspiration to the young people who are following us, so that we can use this intellect and regain the wisdom of the indigenous people who thought, how will this decision affect generations ahead? And today we're thinking, how will this decision affect me now, the next shareholders meeting, my next political campaign? But I truly do believe in the indomitable human spirit and the power of young people. So if you believe that with me, if you think that we can make a difference, can we all say this together? Together we will, together we can, together we will. Shall we try? Together we can, together we will. You're not as good as the kids. Let's try once more. Together we can, together we will. Thank you. Come here.
E te pēpere kou, e te manua titi, e te piki kōtuku, e kore, e mimiti tēnei mihi ki a koe. I just want to thank you so much. It's been such an honour to be here and especially to stand here by you for all the work that you have done to show us the way forward. And I wish you, just thank you so much.